and this is the Convict Australia podcast. Thank you for tuning in. This episode is about a convict transportation ship named the Amphitrite that was shipwrecked on its journey out to Australia. Between 1788 and 1868, hundreds of ships transported roughly 166,000 convicts to Australia. Travelling to Australia by ship meant spending months at sea, and the risks were extremely high. Each ship embarking on this journey to the other side of the world would have faced a range of dangers, such as fire, bad weather, high seas, disease, seasickness, and cramped, unsanitary conditions, just to name a few. These were real fears, but up until 1833, over 70,000 convicts had been transported to the colonies safely. Many were lost to disease, ill treatment, and mutiny, or suspected plans of mutiny, but none of the convict transportation ships had been lost to being shipwrecked. Being shipwrecked was a dangerous prospect. There weren't enough lifeboats to carry everyone on board, and few knew how to swim, including the crew. If they were lucky to make it to shore, there was no way to communicate back home that they needed rescuing. If they were stranded somewhere away from civilization, their life depended on catching the eye of a passing ship. Survivors were faced with the very real prospect of a slow death due to starvation and exposure. Surprisingly, only 5 ships transporting convicts from the UK to Australia were shipwrecked. The first, and perhaps the most heart-rending, was the Amphitrite. The Amphitrite was a very small vessel compared to the other transport ships and was one of the oldest. It was a surprising choice for such a long voyage. The master and part owner of the ship was 33-year-old John Hunter, who had 8 years of experience of being in command of ships under his belt. The surgeon chosen for the voyage was James Forrester. Forrester was in disgrace for his previous voyage on Southworth, where he had dispensed all his medicine without logging the details in his journal. Sir William Burnett warned, "Inform Mr. Forrester that I am by no means satisfied with the reasons he has given for inserting so few cases in this journal, and that if anything of a similar nature should again occur, the certificate to enable him to obtain the remainder of his pay, etc., will not be granted." His appointment was an opportunity for Forrester to redeem himself. Along for the ride was his wife, who had been granted permission to travel with him. This was highly unusual, and it is assumed that they had plans to settle in New South Wales. Roughly 106 female convicts, their 12 children, a crew of 16, along with Forrester and his wife, boarded the ship. Most of the convicts were from all over Britain, with a large portion taken from Newgate Prison. Elizabeth Fry, the Quaker humanitarian, had armed many of them with Bibles, sewing kits, and a fresh set of clothing before boarding. Once below deck, the female convicts and their children were assigned a berth. Each sleeping berth was shared by 3 girls and a child, if they had any. This amounted to roughly 18 inches each, quite a luxury for some. The height between the decks was horrendous for most though, as it was only 5.5 feet, and less than 5 under the beams. The average height of the women was 5 feet 1 3/4 inches, with the tallest being 5 foot 8.5 inches. It was the surgeon's role to look after the prisoners and keep them occupied and in line. The boatswain, John Owen, vented his frustration in a comment. "The women had the range of the ship. The doctor let them go where they liked. He never took any notice if they did not make a riot." Owen was so exasperated with the surgeon's lack of control that he frequently had to take matters into his own hands, resorting to throwing water over the women that wouldn't leave the crew alone to do their work. The language and behaviour of some of the women shocked him so much he described it as outrageous and disgusting beyond anything the men had ever heard. Forrester had brought a punishment box with him and set it up on the top deck. The box stood upright in the sun like a vertical coffin. Before the ship had even left Woolwich, a prisoner had been confined in the box. It was extremely narrow, making it impossible to sit down and very difficult to bend the knee. The height of the box was relatively low, and many prisoners had to hunch their shoulders and press their chin down on their chest to fit inside. For the poor person locked inside, it was like being buried alive. It was painfully hot, with only a few holes at the top to prevent suffocation. The prisoner was often forced to endure hours of this and feared that they may have been forgotten about. If they screamed, a bucket of water was poured over them. This punishment subdued even the most troublesome prisoner. The Amphitrite left Woolwich on the 25th of August in 1833, at a time of year that should have been ideal. However, they had only been sailing for a day when they ran into a fierce summer gale. Instead of turning back, they decided to press on. On the 30th of August, conditions worsened, and the small ship struggled in treacherous waves, fierce winds, and poor visibility. Despite the best efforts of the crew to keep the small vessel away from the French coastline, it grounded in a sandbank 3/4 of a mile from shore. It was low tide, so Hunter dropped the anchor to await the incoming tide. He was certain that the ship would float off when the tide turned. The locals knew better. They had seen the sands of Boulogne claim vessels far stronger than the Amphitrite. Meanwhile, thousands of spectators gathered on the beach to witness the stranded ship. A pilot boat set out to rescue them, but Hunter, believing that they were not in serious danger, declined the offer and sent them away. He also didn't want to risk the women being able to escape into France. When the pilot boat returned to shore, a French sailor by the name of Pierre Henin tied a light rope to himself and swam for about an hour to the ship. He was concerned that the commander of the pilot boat hadn't been able to convey the critical situation the ship was in to the master in English. When he finally reached the ship and asked them to throw down a line so he might save them, they refused him too. Flabbergasted and utterly spent, he was left with no choice but to swim back to shore. The rescue attempts began to sow seeds of doubt in the mind of Forrester, and he ordered the boatswain to lower the longboat. However, Forrester's wife refused to share a boat with the convicts, so the idea was abandoned. By now, panic had set in, and the women and children who had been locked into the hold below had broken free, and their cries of anguish and distress were carried on the wind and could be heard by the French, who watched on helplessly. Hours later, when the tide finally came in, it battered the Amphitrite, breaking it in two. Within a few minutes, the ship had collapsed to pieces. Everyone on board fell into the water, desperately scrambling to grab hold of pieces of the wreckage. By 2 a.m, it was all over. By morning, the beach was littered with dead bodies and parts of the wreck. None of the convicts or their children survived. Neither did the master, Forrester, or his wife. only 3 crew members managed to make it to shore, clutching their piece of the torn-apart ship. Tragically, 133 people were drowned in total. Only 82 bodies were ever recovered. The bodies were put into a mass grave nearby, and today there stands a memorial pillar. Perhaps the saddest image of this senseless accident was the body of a woman who was washed ashore, clutching her child in her arms. She was holding on so tightly that her arms couldn't be pried apart. I found this story so sad because it could have turned out so differently. If only the master had listened to the French. If only he'd put his pride and fear of the women escaping into France aside. If Forrester's wife had put her prejudice aside, many might have been saved, including herself. But the thing that will stay with me is the haunting image of the mother and child that were washed ashore. It was such a tragic loss of life that so easily could have been avoided. If you want to read up further on the Amphitrite, I've left a list of book titles in the show notes. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to the Convict Australia podcast. If you'd like to show your appreciation and get more involved, there are a number of ways you can. The first is by signing up to Convict Australia on Patreon, and you will get some perks like the Convict Australia Newsletter. Secondly, leave a review and tell your friends and family. This really does make a huge difference. And lastly, join the Facebook and Instagram group Convict Australia. All the links I've mentioned will be in the show notes. Thank you again. Till next time.